Orson Welles' Citizen Kane is undoubtedly one of the single most influential films of all time. Although it suffered a nondescript release and did not make its budget back at the box office, Welles' inaugural film possesses an innovative structure and distinctive use of form that, it's safe to say, has never been duplicated or successfully imitated. As a result, it has clearly become one of the most widely recognized films of all time, and it would be silly for me to assume that I have to advertise it to you. Citizen Kane has been referenced in comic books, other films, whether consciously or not, and in television, the context of each reference occurring for a different reason and achieving a different effect.
Is his sled. It was his sled from when he was a kid.
The reason for the notoriety that Citizen Kane has achieved is, like the film's meaning, somewhat deceptive. Like any good movie, the technical aspects of Kane are conducive to the story, but with Kane it goes deeper than form being in harmony with content. In Kane, the form informs the content. Famously, Citizen Kane makes use of exaggerated light and shadow to create a dynamic, larger-than-life portrait of the larger-than-life Charles Foster Kane, as well as the conflict between fame and morality. The degree to which Welles exaggerates light in the film is reminiscent of the extremely stylistic German expressionist films of the 1930s, such as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu. The concept of chiaroscuro, meaning the relationship between light and shadow in a visual medium, tends to embrace films of the horror and sci-fi genres, where so-called Halloween lighting is used to distort human forms. The simple concept is still in use in modern filmmaking, and is often a tool utilized to scare people. In contrast to the expressionist films, however, or even the noir films with which Kane was contemporaneous, the play of light and darkness in the latter doesn't just mean moral conflict. In Kane, the conflict is social and societal. I'll examine this later. Citizen Kane is ostensibly told through the eyes of reporter Jerry Thompson, whose interviews with the late Charles Foster Kane's former friends and family form the brunt of the plot of the film as an examination of Kane's life through their eyes. In these flashbacks and recollections, the visuals have that signature, aggrandized, even cartoonish sense of light and shadow to show the distortion of events in the minds of those being interviewed by Thompson. Some of these people are inebriated, some may be senile, and most have dubious motives. Throughout Thompson's quest for story, we see Kane as a giant and as an ant in different types of deep focus. We see impossibly massive venues and ludicrously conceived shots of simple occurrences. What we see of Kane is shown through the perspectives of Thompson's interviewees. The degree to which we should believe any given testimony can only be left to the imagination of the viewer in accounts of events in which the narrator wasn't even present, as in the case of this scene, in which Leland recalls events of Kane's life, events which he is clearly absent from. In the same way, this scene takes a perspective that its narrator, Kane's adopted father, could not have been aware of. Throughout all of these scenes, Thompson is seen only in silhouette, quietly taking in all of the information and rarely speaking. His immersion in darkness does not mean that he's evil, however, as one might expect from established conventions of film. When Susan is submerged in shadow, it has nothing to do with her moral compass. Instead, Susan is literally stuck in the shadow of Kane's reputation and myth. Thompson is in a similar position, stuck in the shadow of Kane and unable to put together the proverbial puzzle of his life. In fact, Thompson looks very much like a fellow audience member, his back to us, watching events unfold and sharing our cluelessness as to the nature of Rosebud. Which brings me to my final point. I've examined the dramatic use of chiaroscuro and other techniques such as deep focus to transform Kane within the narratives constructed about him, but there's one major aspect of Citizen Kane which I have not yet addressed, and that is the placement of the fake newsreel at the beginning of the film. The visual style of the newsreel is completely different from the signature look of the rest of the film, looking instead like an actual newsreel from the time period in an example of a pseudo fourth wall break. Clearly the newsreel has a different narrator from the rest of the story. It's ironic that the media men are portraying Kane in such a relatively flat, objective manner in comparison with the testimony offered by Thompson's interviewees, particularly as the film is so critical of the media. Kane's obvious corruption even mirrors that of real-world media magnate William Randolph Hearst, who once allegedly said of the Spanish-American War, "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." With this blurring of lines between entertainment and reality, Wells effectively turns the commentary on Kane into commentary on the medium of film itself. Much has been said about the narrative structure of Citizen Kane, but the most important instance of this structure comes at the beginning, just before the omniscient newsreel, when we see Kane's death. We see those same dynamics between dark and light, that same experimental use of framing and reflection, but this portion of the narrative is not told by anyone. Thompson is not interviewing Kane's nurse, and the nurse was not outside Xanadu in the previous part of the scene. Nobody else is with Kane at this moment. So the narrator here is Wells. And as a result of credibility in Citizen Kane, makes Citizen Kane's use of form almost as enigmatic and elusive as Kane's use of the word rosebud within the story. At the outset of Citizen Kane, the dark forms of the newsmen are as much a silhouette of the audience watching the film as they are the smudges of Wells' fingerprints on the film stock, altering and manipulating the story as he sees fit. The exaggerated shapes and shades which distort the physical forms of the characters are a product of their environment, i.e. the lingering presence of Kane and the narrative layers of Thompson and those he interviews. In this way, Wells finally implicates himself as being as guilty of anachronism as anyone in the narrative, thereby commenting on his own involvement in the film by way of form and content. Wells was arguably never again able to make a film with the same creative freedom as he had while he was making Kane. His life story is relatively similar to the eponymous Kane, and at risk of being quixotic, or worse, redundant, it's interesting to view Citizen Kane as an earnest reflection on narrative and author by way of style, rather than merely analyzing the style. The end result is a film which is as accessible as tabloid, and yet as unreachable as a dead man's memory.
The best